Welcome to Convo Heals, the transformative mental health podcast.
We're three remarkable women from diverse backgrounds.
Join forces to harness the incredible healing power of conversation.
Each season, we embark on a journey
of exploration, empathy, and shared experiences
to illuminate the profound impact that thoughtful dialogue can have on our lives.
Welcome once again to the Convo Heals podcast. I'm Dr. Erica.
Dr. Brandy.
And Dr. Ravo.
We're in season 1 talking about parenting whole. And we've been sprinkling in this idea of parenting as souls, of souls, not of behavior. We're not parenting behavior, you guys. We're not.
That makes it sound so much better and so much more inviting, doesn't it?
Yeah, we're raising souls.
That's
and
right.
we are souls. And today's episode is really about the soul, about the human soul. We're talking about play, creativity, and spirituality all together. Mm-hmm. And we were prepping for this episode and talking about whether or not these should be together in an episode, whether or not we wanted to pull them apart. And maybe in the future we will create some mini episodes on each one, maybe some full episodes, depending on where the conversation takes us. But why they're all woven together in this moment as maybe our foundational episode on this topic is that play, creativity, wonder, spirituality, these are very much the exercise of the soul, the habits of the soul. And they are all kinds of things that in modern Western society, we've relegated to the sphere of the secondary, the supplementary, and even maybe we look down on these things as parts of childhood or for people who are
Wasteful,
simple. But they are very much the most human parts of us and the exercise of being human. So as I'm getting into the science today, I'm going to be talking actually about a few different things. Where I want to ground us is in the idea that this is very much the exercise of being human, and therefore it shows up in the Western sense in the psychological sciences through an area of what we call positive psychology and happiness studies. I'm hedging a little bit on this. This is a little bit hard for me to name as the source because the subfield of positive psychology and the psychological sciences is relatively new. All of psychology we've talked about on this podcast is kind of a young, still evolving science, and positive psychology especially is really in its infancy, I think, in terms of what we understand about it. We haven't really done a lot of good research on positive emotions like joy, as we discussed in the last episode. But the other thing is that positive psychology has been co-opted from African psychology, primarily, and Black psychologists who have been talking about these concepts for a long time, and other cultural groups throughout the globe. Indigenous wisdoms in many countries talk about these concepts. When I really look back into my own wisdoms as a Jewish person, I see a lot of these concepts showing up, like gratitude is a big part of the research on positive psychology. So I want to name it as the subfield that those listening who are really immersed in the science and in the clinical field will really understand and hear. But I need to name that also, that it didn't originate there. Play, creativity, wonder, spirituality are well known in the psychological sciences as what we call resiliency traits and behaviors. These are ways that we buffer ourselves against stress, engaging in the arts, engaging in spiritual endeavors with community. Recently, a rabbi at my temple was really happy to tell congregants during a sermon that people who engage in their religious communities have longer lives and better health by a lot. The research is really robust. And he's absolutely right. I loved that he brought this to that space. And the reason is that spiritual community is is healthy and promotes wellness in the act of prayer, which is like hope in action. It is the ways that we think about possibility, a lot of us, but also engaging in rituals with your people, your community is uplifting. There's so much about spiritual communities that give us life. But the other things that, so that's there. We know that these are things that cultivating them are some of our best resources for mental wellness. Giving your kids these tools are some of the best shots they have at really being well. It's not fidgets, you guys. It's not deep breathing during a math test. They need art class, and they need to freely make music and listen to music, not necessarily for professional purposes. They need to create. And we're going to come back to that, I think, more when we get into the wisdom and the practice. But something that I think is really fascinating to know, if you are someone who really needs to be moved on this topic, really needs to know how central play, creativity, wonder, and spirituality are to being human, if you're not somebody necessarily that has access right now to knowing that in your gut, to knowing that from the lived experience, an area of the science that I think is so fascinating is when we cross disciplines and we look at anthropology, sociology, along with the psychological sciences. And what we find out about humans is that play and spirituality show up in all societies, as long as we have our archaeological evidence. And in fact, there was this great article that came out recently in our show notes. I'm going to find it and post it, that really spoke to me. That was a really wonderful review of a lot of the archaeological evidence that the greatest developments in human evolution, when there have been big kind of cataclysmic bursts forward, it is not because there was, people working all night in a lab, or because the smartest engineers hunkered down over paper and made a plan. These are the ways that sometimes we carry our innovations forward. Everyone's important in the ecosystem, but the big shifts forward in human evolution typically involved spiritual and religious practices, alcohol, and celebration. So often in the context of spiritual and religious community, people were drinking, they were partying, they were dancing. What did they produce? All of that joy, all of that sticky joy. And it's a moment when hearts and brains came together and they were connected to the world. And that is actually where we have been able to really move ourselves forward in societies. So that's actually how critical the habits and the practice of playfulness and creativity and engaging in open-ended wonder and exploring your spirituality, the shape of your soul and your connection to the universe. That's how I think defining it in this moment. That's just how important it really is to who we are as humans and the progress we've been able to make. The other thing that I maybe want to sort of tack on here when we think about the science is that I like to think of the practice of wonder as the antidote, the cure to suffering and mental health problems. I like to think of anxiety, for example. Anxiety, we are in a huge crisis related to especially children's anxiety. And so I really think of anxiety as a stuckness. It's a crying out for connection and for minds to be brought together. It's when your thoughts get trapped, you're searching for solutions, but we weren't meant to find solutions on our own. We were meant to celebrate and dance and connect and find them together. So wonder, we're finding both at a level of wisdom, right? But also research is showing engaging in open-ended curiosity and wonder is how we get unstuck. It's how we create spaciousness and slow down. And it's how we remind ourselves answers are coming and they are in progress. If I don't know it, it's because I don't have it alone. It's because it hasn't shown up yet. There's good research that a habit, a practice, a stance of wonder is an important, cure, antidote response to the mental health crisis that we're in. So I think that's a little bit of a broad overview on the science. What do you guys think? Is there anything else we should tap into before we move on in terms of what the research evidence says about these concepts?
No, I think we covered it pretty thoroughly. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the research around spirituality and faith is really rigorous and strong, that it's so protective against all the things that we try to avoid.
I wonder if we should kind of name here the reason maybe we feel like we have to press that point is because there's definitely, I think, a very normative conversation about the harms of religiosity.
Yes.
I'm so glad you.
And I wonder
that's
if we
what
need
I'm
to
sitting
talk
thinking
about
about.
that.
Yeah, that's what I'm sitting thinking about, and I think it's a perfect segue to the cultural wisdom, honestly. I think they're going to flow together really well because, and I would love to hear what scientifically we can contribute in this way, because that is culturally for me has been a very contentious relationship, almost as if spirituality can't exist within religion, and that religious can't be represented throughout spirituality. It's almost like they're in conflict, and in a lot of ways, for me, culturally, it has been. So I'd love to hear what you would say about that, and then we can dive into the cultural wisdom.
So I really asked this question explicitly sort of from the research. I went looking for this question when I was teaching courses on positive psychology for undergraduate and graduate students in a university setting. And I asked this question because I feel very much in my own life, like my sense of spirituality integrated with my religious practices as a Reformed Jewish person and a practitioner are beautifully integrated. I don't personally feel that conflict, but I also have been kind of, I feel like there's a strand of anti-Semitism that has named my religion as a problem. And so I really wondered about this, actually. I'm somebody who is always open-minded to new information, new knowledge, and is willing to be flexible about my own thinking. And I do also think about the ways that there are toxicities within religions and within religious practices, and how religion is sometimes used in toxic ways. And so I really wondered about this. And there's research about this. The first thing is that there are ethno-racial divides in this research. When we talk about religion being a risk factor, we're typically talking about white Christian people, at least in terms of who's been studied and where the research is, and primarily when we're talking about the investment in humanity and the uplift, where often who we've really done that work with are Black, usually Christian Americans. And so in some ways, what we already have from the research is this restricted kind of view, but we can learn from one another. And so some of the broad ideas from each of those areas is that there are risk factors in religion when rules are enforced in abusive ways. And so that really comes down to less the spiritual practices of the religion itself. It's not the religion that's the problem. It's the way that sometimes some people seeking power can use religious practices to exploit and harm others. And because we often feel spirituality and our sense of who we are within our communities is so central to who we are, it simply makes for a great propaganda tool. At the individual level, at the communal level, you can really get people to do harmful things in the name of spiritual practices. So that's kind of the weaponization of religion that can be a problem. But when we look at spiritual practice, when we ask people about things like prayer, community, this belief in something beyond ourselves, our sense of ourselves within the interconnected universe, it's a spiritual practice. Things adjacent to spiritual practices like gratitude, forgiveness, empathy, these things are all full stop, promotive and protective for us.
Ditto.
Yeah. I think so much about going back to the cultural wisdom
Yes.
around my own culture growing up in a primarily Muslim country. And my parents, they were part of the Iranian Revolution. They saw the Iranian king leave and the Islamic government to come, and the pain that they experienced, that in their mind was an association between organized religion and government practices that were oppressive. And I, from a very, very young age, got exposed to spirituality around those who have transitioned. So in regards to talking about my grandparents who had passed, and it was taught to children that these individuals love you and are looking over you and keeping you safe and wishing good things for you and have wisdom for you and waiting for you. But aside from that, it was not really something that was shared within my own family culture. But I felt this sense of connection to a higher power and to my ancestors that I hid from my parents because they thought the idea of God was really silly. And I will never forget when we came to America, my uncle's friend died, and he said to my dad, "We have to go to the mosque." And my dad said, "I didn't travel all the way from Iran to America to go to a mosque. I will not go." And so these things kind of really affected me. And we got here a few months after 9/11. So I had a lot of internalized shame around being Iranian. And I grew up in this, I think, generation in Michigan where it was cool to be an atheist. And so I really disconnected from that part of myself within my family, given that my mom identifies as an atheist and my dad, I think, is maybe more spiritual, but for sure very, very anti-organized religion. And lived that way for most of my 20s, and it wasn't until the pandemic where something called within me saying, and I think my brother passing, when he passed, I remember feeling so envious of his friends who had spirituality in their lives, and they were using it as a way to make meaning, make sense, cope. And I could feel this energy in them, and I would feel envious that I didn't have that. And so it's my history around spirituality and faith and religion is really complicated, as I wonder if it is for you too, Brandy. It's multi-layered. And I've worked hard to no longer hold on to shame around the truth I have within me and not feel this need to justify it for anybody. And just be able to be grounded in it, in the way I move and live. And it's one of the most powerful things I've been able to do.
Complicated is quite an understatement. And I think, Dr. Erica, you have named a part of why that is in a way that I so much appreciate, because I think the relationship to religion for many, many Black Americans, and I say Black very intentionally because we have the diaspora of Blackness is very broad, but it's also very singularly experienced as separate from our ethnicities. And I know aspects of that, my like real heritage in name, but I don't know it in experience. The part of me that's Nigerian, and the part of me that's French Canadian, and the part of me that's Cambodian, I don't have a lot of direct connections to that I haven't like sought for myself. And a part of that is because of the history of this country that you've named, where it has successfully stripped away even the recognition that even exists,
Yes.
let alone hold and carry. But what I am very connected to is a Blackness, and that has been birthed out of spirituality and resilience and connectedness and so many beautiful, beautiful things. And the way all of this connects to the complicated nature of religion is that I don't want to overgeneralize here because that would be incredibly disrespectful, but I have experienced and observed a collective Black experience to religion that is really more a representation of the indoctrination of our people, not really spiritual. And that the utility of it and the value of it has always been connected to exactly what you said. Power, control, and, you know, you got to follow these rules to be good and to go to heaven. And you've got to do these things in order to be respected. But what is also true is the spiritual manifestation of something bigger than even that, than even indoctrination and dogma in organized religion, which is what you were naming, like some of the ritualistic practices of connectedness within, connectedness above and around and between, and, you know, devotionals and, you know, hymnals and prayer and like this shared spoken language around healing and hope. And you said forgiveness, and you said, but also grace.
Yes.
And care and tenderness, and the undercurrent and the underbelly of all of it is something that keeps coming up in every single episode and is palpable even here with us, which is relational. So when I talk to my God, it's so intimate.
Yeah.
And it's so healing. And when I talk to the universe or my higher power or, you know, Omega or whatever you want to call it, it's such a powerful, I don't even know the word I'm looking for. It kind of helps to make it all a little bit less complicated.
It's so interesting that we've had very different backgrounds, but that is a very shared experience for me as well, where the relationship feels, the intimacy is for me actually very playful intimacy, where I do get to have a lot of curiosity around what's happening for me and where I'm going and what is the right next decision to make. But it for sure internally feels that way.
And I'd like to share some other language that feels true for me culturally. And people say it in different ways. They talk about their gut or, you know, the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
And I think
The voice.
you know, I hear God and you know,
And
that
the
kind of
wisdom,
things. Yeah. And it's a very intuitive knowing, and it's a very quiet, sometimes confidence and connection and anchoring. And, that's the spirituality. I love earlier, Dr. Ravo, when you were describing the ancestral elements of this and that ancestral healing piece of that connects us when it comes to spirituality too. That feels true for me as well.
Something I want to draw out here that I'm hearing in this conversation, and the reason, again, we sort of thought about putting these concepts together, is that you talked about how spirituality is a vehicle for finding meaning. You use that word meaning. And Dr. Brandy, you're really talking about how you're creating meaning in a back and forth in some ways within your sense of spirituality. And play is scientific in the ways that humans are scientific. Play is experimentation, creativity, wonder, exploration. And what the research shows is that play is a way that we see children making meaning of their worlds. We build on that in therapy with kids, that we are playing out stories together because we want to help them create elongated narratives about hard things, to pull in new details, to wonder outside the box. And spirituality is that kind of open-ended wondering. It's playful. It's, as you said, it's about asking questions, being able to be curious in ways that aren't guided or don't necessarily have, you're not asking a question and there's a right answer.
Yeah.
Well, that's a playful orientation to this life.
Yeah, and it's also not allowed in the way in which I was taught religion. It's not allowed. You do not ever question.
Yes.
Right? And that's not
What we're talking
about.
Yeah.
I'm thinking so much about at my organization, because we do so much play therapy and we train clinicians to become child-centered play therapists. And within that work, we teach clinicians how to surrender, let go of control, and stay curious. It is really the core of it. And that is like when you are really engaging in healing play, right? And which are, I really think, core components of accessing your own internal spirituality. So the overlap is really interesting, because you have to surrender to the is and want to experience it as is, not as how it should be.
And to put kind of like a framing on this, if you don't mind, because I know there are people listening who are really following us, who are like, you're speaking to my soul. I know there are going to be other people out there that are like, hold on a second.
You didn't win a little too,
Some of you are capitalists and hustlers, and we're losing you a little bit. So something else I want to say about this, and again, why we thought about weaving these together, is that the ability to be a problem solver is actually, it has less to do, almost little to do, with the knowledge you bring into the situation. The best problem solvers are able to think about the problems we face in new and novel ways. They have to be able to be creative-minded, to play around and experiment and not be afraid to try things and fail and try again. And they have to have some spiritual sense of purpose and meaning to intrinsically drive them to keep working at the problem. And I learned recently that Crayola has a partnership with NASA for this reason, because NASA understands this, that these concepts, play, creativity, wonder, what we're calling spirituality and purpose and meaning, are what every person who works for NASA needs to know to move that work forward.
Mic drop.
Mic drop. So I hope everyone's on board with this conversation, where we think about play and creativity as not just
Coloring a picture.
and not just like
Within the lines, Hasti. You cannot go outside
not
the
leisure.
lines.
Not even the leisure also is important. I mean, it's hard to put a name on this, but it is the core of what we do. It should be the core of every school curriculum. It should be the basis from which all work environments are radiating. It's that important to how we are raising real change makers in this world.
There's such a, I hesitate to say it this way, but I can't think of another way. You're kind of acknowledging that while it is fun and it is leisure enhancing, it's also practical and purposeful, and outcomes exist there, and achievement does exist there, and there's so much usefulness to this concept. It's not just like when you're when you're done doing all the work, you know?
And I think something that is important for people to understand is that because of the world that we live in, and because of the very toxic culture we are exposed to, it does, and we've had this conversation around being committed to recommitting. That when it comes to staying grounded to the spiritual side of you, to the playful side of you, to the creative part of you, you have to be willing to keep recommitting and making room for getting off course. And I think having that dynamic with yourself to notice what gets you off course. You know, so for me, I noticed that in relationships, when I get really committed to identifying the other person as the villain and wanting to become like, you know, making a case for them that how they're the bad guy, and wanting to find an audience somehow, like calling a friend and being like, can you believe, right? I'm not really venting and seeking emotional support. I want someone else to be bad and for me to be the victim. That's a signal for me that I'm spiritually not aligned. And when I have that need so badly to want to do that, I know that I'm spiritually not aligned. And so I think I've learned that it's important for us to want to be committed to even that process of learning what the alarms are, right? And for somebody else, it might be the need to control, things internally, or externally. It could be with controlling our body, controlling food, controlling our children.
Controlling our outcomes,
Controlling
our
outcomes.
feelings.
Controlling our feelings.
I love that you're saying this, because I can't stop thinking about something I've grown up hearing and saying, but everyone seems to have a really hard time existing within, which is let go and let God. And it's like, conceptually we get that. And yet what you're describing is this necessary kind of ideological shift around what that means, because it's such a scary thing to do. It's such a hard thing to do. And it's like, no, it's the very thing to do. And to see how you show up in that, like when you're moving more fluidly in alignment with your spirituality, you don't even need it.
And it requires surrendering to our humanity that of course we will get off course.
Right.
Of course we will not want to let go. We will want to have control. So I think like accepting that part of myself, the human within me, that will want to control my child, that will want to control my body as a woman, right? And what I eat, and control how much maybe money I make and how people perceive me. That's the human within me.
That's true too.
You know what? Something this is really making me think of, when we do these segments on the wisdom, I usually tap into being Jewish. But actually what I'm thinking about as my cultural wisdom on this topic right now is being a person with ADHD. And the reason I want to talk about it that way is because what we're understanding so much more now is that ADHD is not an illness or a pathology. It's really a different way of orienting to the world than people who are exist as normative in like what we call a neurotypical environment. And you said something in the last episode about maybe what it is to be neurotypical. Maybe it's not a difference in brain wiring. This is what made me think of, but that it's more like neurotypical people are more malleable in some ways to sort of agreed upon curricula, that it's easier to align with ways of doing at a group level. And maybe neurodivergence is a more of a resistance to being kind of pulled in. And the reason I'm thinking about all of this way is because then it sort of feels like there's a cultural practice in some ways around having ADHD that's very playful, wondering. When you talked about this idea of surrendering, but what it really feels like for me is coming home to myself. The surrender in some ways feels like more what I do when I'm giving up and I'm like, I'll do it the way you want me to do it. Just as a really concrete example of this, I'm not very organized. And the way people usually give me tips or strategies to get more organized are things that work for neurotypical people, like set alarms, calendar, make lists.
Which would require you to
And
be more
the
organized
labor,
to be able to be more
and
organized.
also it's like there's almost a spiritual drain on me to do that.
Yes.
There's something I resist about the energy that would go into making a list that
Yes.
makes me sad. I can't explain it any other way. It's like I'm grieving. or
Well,
sad.
there's the energy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like, you know.
My first reaction also as someone with ADHD is, can't you just do it for me? Can't you love me in that way and just do it for me?
Right, if you care so much about this. But what but what I have found works for me
Yeah.
is establishing meaning.
Right.
I can do anything if I believe in it.
Right.
And that is about really being close to the awe in me, the spiritual side. I have to establish that basis, which isn't always easy to do with everyday things, but I can get there. I can get there.
It's not as much a resistance as it is a commitment.
Yes, then it becomes a commitment.
Yeah.
And I have to be able to do it in playful ways. So it's like the connection to my values, but then also how can I make it fun and open-ended? And lists cut you off from the open-endedness.
Yes.
So the grocery store exists as a site of terror for me because what would work for me, I think, to grocery shop
Yeah.
is to wander,
Yes.
to invent recipes, right? To smell the fruits and vegetables. And I don't afford myself the spaciousness of that. I don't think about that as being the goal. So I'm running through there with these extrinsic motivating factors in mind. I got to get dinner on the table. It has to please everybody. I got to get this and this and this. Don't forget. And that doesn't work. That drains me.
Yeah.
And you have
hard on me.
stumbled into the practice.
I've stumbled into the practice, you guys. Here we are. The practice.
The practice. What does this look like in real time? It looks like inventing recipes as you walk down aisle 9. You know,
Maybe.
how fun. Maybe. No, we can't do that.
Maybe. let's
I do think in this episode, this topic we're talking about, creativity, play, spirituality, it is non-negotiable and essential to tap to the self to be in the practice for the parenting.
Oh, yes.
Like to do any kind of practical strategy to parent your child through the play and the creativity and the spirituality, you have to tap into the authentic you,
Yes.
the real you. And I think it is the first step. Because without it, everything else will fall apart.
And it's burdensome. It becomes burdensome. It's very consequential to the joy that is available to all of us as parents. Yes, it's challenging. It does feel stressful at times. I'm never going to discredit that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're right.
And I know that there are people listening who are thinking, I'm not a creative person. I'm not a playful person, or like I'm not a spiritual person. So like, oh my God, I am failing as a parent, right? How am I going to be shepherding my children now through these things? And I think that again goes back to parents thinking creativity should look this way.
That's right.
Playfulness should look this way.
Yes.
Spirituality should look this way. I was having a conversation once with somebody who was saying, I have this image. I'm old and I have this house and I have my woodworking and there's grandkids running around and we're near water and there's joy. And I said, that's spirituality.
Right.
That you're tapping into, that is the part of you that's spiritual. As you're talking, and I can feel the energy, I can visualize it. And so I think people have to realize it looks different for everybody. And that is okay, because we're all different.
I love that. I love the words that come to mind is just imagery and fantasy. And, you know, again, we're always talking about stories. And we usually don't think of things like that when we talk about creativity or spirituality. You know, fantasy is for people that have nothing to do. Huh? No.
I have two thoughts on this I want to share that I think are practical. One is that I really want parents to think more about mutually pleasurable experiences with their kids. This is so important to me. Parents say to me all the time that they have a hard time focusing, sustaining attention when they're playing with their children.
Right.
And they're ashamed of it. They feel like, I know I'm on my phone too much. I'm embarrassed. What can I do? How can I be more mindful, more present? And they're kind of like laboring to be present. And I ask a very simple question. Are you doing boring things with your kid? Because it is hard to sustain attention when the activity is boring. And what they say back is, well, yeah, but it's not for me. It's for the child. But children are paying attention to how we communicate, and they pay attention to our words the least, because words are the most fallible. They're paying attention to our energy and what they intuit from us. And we're teaching them what relationships are like.
Yeah.
So play and creativity and spirituality, it has to be mutual and reciprocal and collective. And we have to invite our children to be real partners in this life. This is very much, I want to say, connected to my own community and spirituality. For me, we think about raising Jewish children this way. We're just a tiny group of people, and we need them to carry our rituals forward. So very early on, we do orient the children as full partners. And so I really extend that into parenting. So very practically, your child wants to, I don't know, what's boring, you guys? I'm weird. I really like kids. And I'm very expansive, actually, about what kinds of play I can get in on.
Like kids?
Like, sometimes so let's say your child likes to play.
Pretend play for a lot of parents.
hard.
Like
Okay.
doll pretend play.
So let's say there's doll play, and
For some parents
you're
can feel
sitting
really
there and you're
boring.
thinking, I'm jumping out of my skin.
Yeah.
Well, here's actually a spiritual moment. You're feeling who you are in that moment. I don't feel myself rushing out to this. Name it. I love being with you.
Right.
You love doll play. For me, doll play doesn't light me up. I want to do this for a few minutes, and then can we switch activities, and I want to show you something that lights me up that I want to do with you. Now you're giving your child a chance to be in a real relationship with you. And trust me, they want to know you. And that is a spiritual moment when souls really connect. That is how play gives us a chance to explore that. What is highly likely is there are people listening to this who are thinking, I don't even know what that activity would be.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
here is a time for that playful exploration.
Yes.
Children are wonderful teammates to find yourself with.
There are a lot of parents listening who will say, nobody ever played with me. No one ever spent that kind of time with me when I was a child. So it's really hard for me to get on the floor. And I think it's important to just stay really curious and open to different things. You don't know.
Well, you don't know, and what you were describing earlier about that re-engaging. I mean, who am I today? Like, I mean, I didn't like tomatoes 3 years ago, and now I do. I know that's a trivial thing, but like, I'm there's so much available to us about even us.
Yes.
Like to just see the way in which we're expanding and we're growing and we're changing. And wow, I didn't even know I liked this. I didn't even know this about myself. The wonder, and even this kind of piece about, I am of the perspective that I do matter. That everything I do is not just for you. That it's that I'm important too.
Yes.
And so I think that's a part of what we're naming too, that we're not just sacrificial lambs on behalf of our children. That's a part of what makes it burdensome. We're here experiencing together.
Yeah.
And I think one of the ways that I've noticed trying to bring more or honor, I don't even want to say bring, but just notice and honor around play in my home, and the word playful, because I also think sometimes we're very literal, like we need to do an activity of play, but a lot of things can be playful.
Yes.
Sweeping the floor can be playful, you know. I mean, you know, washing the dishes can be playful. Anything can really be playful. And I think what has been helpful in my home that I've noticed is how I am to be taken seriously. However, it's kind of boring to always be taking myself so seriously, like just doing random things, or my kids kind of teasing. We have a home where we're constantly kind of joking or teasing or kind of poking fun in lighthearted ways, creating, or I don't even want to say creating, but like noticing these inside jokes or these kind of inside things that are really sacred to us as a family. That's play, and it wasn't even really organized.
Yes.
And it's and there's space to let those moments flow.
Right.
Which is where we sort of say that's play too, is even opening up space, whether or not humor arrives,
Right.
that it's playful to be slower, flexible, open, peaceful sometimes.
Like a slow walk in the neighborhood. The last thing I do want to add that I think is really important as parents are listening, because it can feel like, I have such a long way to go in these areas. I'm a very literal person. I'm a doer. So like I have to go home and tap into these parts of me, and for the sake of my child, right? And I think it goes back to this idea for me in particular that I really believe in so strongly, that we're not meant to be our child's teacher in every way. And it's so important they're surrounded by so many people.
Yes.
And that's okay. So maybe there's somebody else within your village who loves to just get on the floor and do that pretend doll play all day. That is okay.
That's right.
And maybe for you and where you are in your journey of growth, this one is going to take a long time. You're not failing, right? That's why I think it's so important to invite a diverse group of loving humans into your village, around your children, and that you're not carrying all the burden of raising these souls by yourself as you're raising your own soul, because you know, it's kind of like what you said about you didn't like tomatoes, right? Sometimes it can take a long time to learn to love tomatoes, but maybe it will move really quickly this year. We don't know. In the meantime, let's take some of the pressure off of ourselves as parents and think about the strengths within the people around us and what they can bring to the table for our children.
Yes.
I love that. If we have a couple of minutes, I want to add one last practical recommendation that I do hope will help folks. I think we're all really sensing among other parents we know that playfulness is difficult to access, maybe. That this episode may feel like a whole challenge. And I want to really emphasize that we're talking about small moments. We're talking about a stance, less than we're saying do this, do that. We're saying open your heart to possibility, potential, see the unknown as something that you don't have to engineer, that you can wonder about, that it is safe to wonder about, that it is even fruitful to wonder about with your children, to treat them as partners in this life, to be you, to find you. Sometimes I'm playful by talking out loud a little bit, saying the weird thoughts to come to mind and saying them to my kids and letting them react or not react. It's really the small things that we hope we are challenging you to open your heart to. But the last thing I think I want to really challenge folks to do that I think can give everybody a boost in opening up space for the spiritual, the creative, the wonder. Ever since I read this article about how religion and alcohol and dancing and celebration, how vital this is to who we are and how we move life forward, and I know what unites all parents is that we want our kids to have a life full of possibilities. That is shared, I think. And I want to really connect that want, that need back to this conversation about playing. And I want you to hold in your image this idea of people wild, dancing, celebratory. And I want you to think about what that could look like in your household, in your community, in your village, in your relationships, however that comes up. Where are you wild, limitless? The more you start to bring those threads in, I think the more you're going to find your own wisdom and practice on this topic. Well, I think that is the end of this particular convo we're having on play and creativity and spirituality, but we love this conversation. We have so much to say. And I really hope those of you who are listening, this felt like a healing convo, one that's just getting started for you in your homes. You can go home and ask your family members tonight, how are we playful? When do we play? And I want to play together more. Open up the conversation at home. Thank you for being here with us. We will see you next time.
The Convo doesn't stop here. For links to the resources and research mentioned in today's episode, head on over to the show notes at convoheals.com/5. That's convoheals.com/5.